years. It comes as interim authorities govern Venezuela following the capture of former dictator Nicolas Maduro. Here's more.
The U.S. State Department says the move will promote stability, support economic recovery, and advance what it calls political reconciliation in Venezuela. Maduro cut diplomatic ties with the U.S. in 2019 after Washington refused to recognize him as the country's president. Venezuela's interim government says it's committed to entering a new phase of constructive dialogue grounded in what it called the sovereign equality of states. The latest U.S. official in Venezuela was Doug Burgum, Secretary of the Interior. He says the U.S. is very pleased with the direction the country's going in.
We certainly talked about a positive future for this country, and there's a number of things that are happening, again, under the current leadership that are very positive for everybody in this country. And I think you're seeing that in the laws that are being passed. They're, again, creating a framework that is going to be more peace, more stability, and more prosperity for the people of Venezuela.
Burgum said Venezuela's government is giving security assurances to 9 mining companies interested in investing in the country. Mineral areas have long been controlled by guerrilla groups and gangs. Shell Oil Company says it's entering into agreements with the Venezuelan government from offshore natural gas and onshore oil and gas opportunities.
The White House says the Trump administration will be reinforcing its Monroe Doctrine during its Shield of Americas summit this weekend to try to help Latin American countries reduce ties with China. Joining us now to talk about this is Santiago Vidal-Calvo, policy analyst at the Manhattan Institute, and we have Marcos Chatgas, editor-in-chief for the Epoch Times Brazil and Latin America correspondent for the Epoch Times USA. Okay, so good afternoon to you both. San Diego, if I may, I'll start with you today. Can you just talk to us here about the level of influence China and other adversarial nations have in Latin America?
Hey, Don, thank you so much for the invitation. So first of all, China has gone unchecked for years now in Latin America, where they have done massive investments in shady loans to many countries. They have invested in infrastructure, try to get takeovers of very key and very important interests of the United States in the region. And they have a strong armament, many leftist governments around the region to bring them over to their side and to get them away from the sphere of influence of the United States. This has happened over the last decades, and it has gone under the radar of the United States because many of these governments prefer a China that is giving them a free checkbook, a blank check, before a United States that has some conditions about prosperity in the Western Hemisphere and about the security and the interests of the United States. However, this seems to stop with the Trump administration. The Trump administration is taking a posture that China needs to be kicked out of the continent. The Monroe Doctrine renewal is the same type of theory that we're implementing today to kick out foreign regimes and foreign adversaries from our continent because it's ours. And this is a policy that the Trump administration is taking, and it's a good one.
Okay, Marcos, please, anything you'd like to add here about China's influence in Latin America?
Well, I agree with the points that are being made, but I would also like to highlight the fact that this comes as the U.S. Congress has just published a recent report. The Committee on China in the House has just published a recent report where we talk about military capabilities. So we're talking about dual-use capabilities in ports, even space. In Argentina, in the Neuquén province, in the Patagonia region, you have a space base which is directly run by the People's Liberation Army. Not even the administration has free access to it without the PLA's approval. So we're talking about a threat that, as the points, and I agree with the points that were made, they go into influence. When we talk finance, they go into influence. When we talk infrastructure, telecom, and there's also a military side to it with the dual use of military civil technology, military-civil fusion. I also think that the timing of this is very important to highlight as it comes before an expected visit by President Trump to China still this semester, perhaps in April. So all of this ties into the context of the strategic competition between the US and China, and also has a military side.
So Santiago, both of you talked about certain threats and influence that China exerts in Latin America. Can you just put into perspective for us from the U.S.'s point of view? Why does this matter? What threat does this influence pose to the U.S. interests?
Well, let me tell you that some of the biggest...
Oh, please.
I'll have Santiago go first, and then Marcos, I'll ask you.
Awesome, thank you. Sorry about that. So let me tell you that the biggest threats that China had on the continent to the United States have already been dissipated, which was Venezuela. I would say one of the main threats, both in security terms, but also in economic terms for the region. What was this representing? Venezuela was giving oil to Cuba and to adversaries across the world, like Iran and China. This has ceased after the capture of Nicolas Maduro. And this looks very grim to China now, that they have lost one of their key partners in the region. If Cuba falls too, China would also lose one of their main partners in the region. They would only be left with some of the leftist parties around other countries like Colombia or like Ecuador or like Brazil and Argentina that do not have much power anymore because they're in process of transition after a Trump administration has put a big influence in the continent, and presidents like Milei and Bukele have made it their goals to kick out a lot of these leftist parties from the continent. So there is an interest of the United States politically to align the continent politically with the United States. But second, security measures. We cannot have rampant dictators in the region that are allies of China making threats or even having security interests or problems with the United States. And this is what was happening with Venezuela and also happening with Cuba and Nicaragua. If the Trump administration is able to remove those regimes and move them into stable democratic countries, that would be the biggest blow to China in the last decade.
So, Marcos, before you respond here, Santiago brought up Cuba, right? I have a clip here of President Trump hinting at action in Cuba recently after making some comments. Let's take a look at that clip.
We also urge Iranian diplomats around the world to request asylum and to help us shape a new and better Iran with great potential. It's a country with great potential. There's much better future for Iran. It's now beginning. It's going to be, I think, a great future. And people, I want to thank all of the people that have been involved. Marco, you've been doing a fantastic job. And you've been doing a fantastic job on a place called Cuba. What's happening with Cuba is amazing. And we think that we want to finish this one first, but that will be just a question of time.
So, Marcos, in your view, what needs to happen in Cuba to align with our national security interests and to help the Cuban people? Just your overall thoughts on this.
I mean, we're talking about a regime that's very hostile to the U.S., and historically we have seen how this can be a security threat. In 1962, we had the Cuban Missile Crisis, where we went nearly into World War III over Soviet missiles that were put in Cuba. The geographical position of Cuba is once again being weaponized, as we can see from reports in recent years of Chinese influence. And we're talking space capabilities and other asymmetrical warfare, unconventional warfare capabilities being deployed to Cuba on a regime that has before been tied also with Russia and to a very lesser degree to Iran, which was mainly acting in and around Venezuela. So it also has this point to it, but it has also a symbolic aspect. When we talk about the hardest communist guerrilla, the hardest cartels in the region, when we talk about the FARC in Colombia and the ELN in Colombia, when we talk about Varpalmares, MR8 in Brazil in the past century, when we talk about cartels and guerrillas all around the region, most of them have been to a point inspired, trained, or backed by Cuba in one way or another. So the sort of zeitgeist shift, the shift in the spirit of the times that we're discussing, is especially symbolic when we talk about Cuba. And right now, the regime seems to be, in fact, in their last breath. Of course, it might be soon to say in a way, but we just had massive blackouts with 7 million people with no access to electricity in the past few days. So this also bespeaks of the moment we're seeing. And just to add to the point that Santiago was making, I think he's completely right. I would also add the economic dimension. When we talk about lithium in Bolivia, Chile, and Argentina, which is key for technologies like electric cars and resources around the region that can be useful, like Brazil having the second biggest reserves of rare earths, which have been in the news a lot lately.
So, Santiago, you can add something more if you would like, but I want to actually circle back to China. There's one thing I wanted to ask you specifically, and that is about China's ports that it has built in some of these Latin American countries. Could they have, dual use capabilities? For example, could it theoretically be used for military purposes?
Well, let me tell you something. China does nothing out of benevolence and charity. And I think this is what we're seeing across the continent. The only reason why China is involved in Latin America is because they have an interest to have some sort of investment there that is going to advance their purpose here in Latin America. And what is their purpose? To diminish the influence of the United States. That is the only purpose that China is having. The second purpose that you can try to bring is make money, but everybody wants to make money in this world, and China has obviously different ulterior motives. And this is the issue, is that we have not seen in Latin America the investment from China like we saw it in other places around the world. We saw the Belt and Road Initiative being implemented in Africa, in Asia, in the Middle East. Why not see it also in Latin America as an extension of the Belt and Road Initiative? And this has been this case over the last decades. China has invested in ports for their infrastructure, for their security interests. If they control the ports of Latin America, they control the trade of Latin America. And we saw this with the ruling and with the influence that had the Panama Canal on the last couple of months. This has been the influence that China has had. If we continue to allow China, not only ports, but communication, China has invested billions of dollars in communication infrastructure in Latin America, spaceport. I 100% agree with Marcos here on what he's saying with the security interests of China in the region. They have seen Latin America as an adversary of the United States, and Cuba has been a huge influence to implement those goals from China around the continent, because they both have the same goals, to take the United States down. So if we have two big adversaries of the United States trying to do exactly the same thing, then it's only the most appropriate method for the United States to do the country, to try to bring them down in the continent and bring allies closer to ours.
So Marcos, give us your concerns on these specific items, whether we're talking about the ports, the infrastructure investments, debt trap practices. Talk to us about your concerns on these, and what leverage does the U.S. have to convince these Latin American countries to shift their alliance closer to the U.S.?
I mean, the leverage has been increasing. For instance, of course, the attacks on the Caribbean on the narco boats have a big impression. When we're talking about the shift in the international environment, we're talking about the traditional way international relations have been conducted with the United Nations or other organizations being middlemen, shifting essentially to what it used to be before World War II. We're talking about economic pressure, military pressure, and this kind of diplomacy where it's mostly about bilateral relations and even personal relations between the heads of both countries. This shift has allowed the Trump administration to be more assertive and increase its leverage. And this is, I see, a much needed shift when we talk about the geopolitics of the region. So let me expand a little bit on the ports. When we talk about the Shanghai port in Peru, for instance, this is now run by a company called Costco Shipping. There's a lawsuit going on. I won't go into details, but this is now run by a company called Costco Shipping, which is considered part of the Chinese military apparatus by the United States of America. We now have a data cable in Chile, which could essentially have the data of Latin American countries going straight to Hong Kong under the CCP's influence. All of this goes through 2017 cybersecurity law in China, then 2021 anti-espionage law, and other laws put in by the regime, which breach data safety and also allows the Chinese Communist Party to exert pressure by essentially accessing any data they have on any of those countries when you're talking about data cables, right? It goes beyond just the possibility of conventional warfare. So it's not that the ports could be used by a Chinese aircraft carrier to attack the US. That's a farther away possibility, despite theoretically possible. It's about the fact that if a war breaks in the Strait of Taiwan, in the Taiwan Strait, we would be talking about a scenario where the Chinese could pressure Latin American countries into continuing to export iron ore, into continuing to export food, like Brazil, which is one of the biggest food suppliers to China. We could see that supply chains and diplomatic legitimacy could be provided by countries nearby the United States. So when we talk about the war scenario, I think that's the kind of thing that's into discussion. Now, regarding leverage, like I said, I think it's about bilateral diplomacy, personal relations from Trump with leaders in the region. I think it's also about military and economic pressure, which has been hugely leveraged throughout his first year in the second administration. Without going into too much detail, I think this gives the gist of it.
Okay, Santiago, two things. If there's anything you'd like to respond to from what Marco said, you can. And another thing is I wanted to ask you about Iran. You know, with everything that's happening right now with Operation Epic Fury, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you about what is Iran's influence in Latin America?
Well, first, just to close what Marcos was saying, I think he's 100% right with what he's saying about China. And the best thing that the United States could do right now is double down on their influence in the continent, try to buy off a lot of these loans from China and try to offer countries currency swaps or currency deals that they could allow these countries to buy off the loans from China and change them to the United States. I think many of these countries would prefer to have their loans under the United States before China, where the influence of the United States can be controlled and China loses a leverage on the continent. That can be one of the things that the United States could be doing, and they have both the money and the capability and the interest to do this. But to go in Iran, specifically, Iran has had many partners around the region that has helped them advance their interests, but one of the main ones was Venezuela with Hezbollah. Hezbollah had a huge presence in Venezuela because Venezuela was treated as a safe haven for terrorism during the Maduro regime and before in the Chavez regime as well. We have pictures of Chavez with the previous president of Iran. They were good buddies, and even the president of Iran, the former president of Iran, used to go to the funeral of Chavez. That was 2 days ago. Yesterday, sorry, we were celebrating almost 12 years of the death of Chavez. So, this is very important relationship for the region. And after Maduro's capture, Iran's influence in the continent has greatly been reduced. People underestimate how much of an influence Venezuela and Iran had in the relationship around the continent. Hezbollah has set up security and interest for Iran in Venezuela to spy on the United States, even so much that there are reports from Congress and also from Venezuela that Venezuela gave 10,000 fake Venezuelan passports to Iranian nationals to cross the border here illegally in the United States and enter. Hezbollah officials that enter under Venezuelan fake passports. This happened under the last years, and it happened under the watch of the United States, and we need to fix this really quickly. And one of the main steps was to remove Maduro from power.
Okay, Marcos, I'll end with you today. Your final thoughts on Iran's influence in Latin America.
So just to expand on what Santiago was saying, the passport scheme in Venezuela was so big that in 2007, they even planned a terrorist attack on JFK Airport in New York coming from Guyana and Venezuela, which was thwarted last minute by the FBI. We're talking about narco cartels throughout the region, trading in arms and drugs with Hezbollah, including nearby where I'm at right now in the Argentina-Paraguay-Brazil border in Foz do Iguaçu. This is the kind of thing which has created also an influx in the last administration of people in the US terror watch list throughout the southern border. And you see the menace of this rogue terrorist regime expanding throughout the US's neighbors and into the United States. In a matter of about 2 months, this administration has debunked this scheme to the point where its main leader in the region, Nicolás Maduro, is in jail, and its main leader in the Middle East, Ali Khamenei, is dead. We see a reversal of the US's adversaries' influence in the region, going from Iran to China, even to Moscow to an extent, because Venezuela was also a forward operating base for Russian influence in the region. This all comes not only before the summit we have on Saturday, but before President Trump's visit to Beijing in April or sometime in the first semester of this year. I think the message is very clear to the US adversaries, and when Donald Trump steps into China in the near future, he'll have the leverage of what has happened close to home in the past 2 or 3 months.
Okay, well, very profound conversation today, coming as no surprise from two incredible analysts. But thank you both for speaking with us today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
The February jobs report showing an unexpected job loss. More on the numbers and reactions from National Economic